Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is Rad Kirmani, and I will be your presenter for today's webinar. I have a decade of experience in corporate negotiation and a background in management and psychology. I've spent the last 5 years observing and studying communication psychology, cognitive performance, emotional regulation, and human behavior. For now, all of your mics have been muted, and that's for the reason for not having an accidental spur up. After the session, we will change that for the Q&A, but for now, it's going to be this way. My screens are two, so please apologize if my point of view keeps changing from time to time. I have a screen sharing on one side, I have you guys and my notes on the other, so I will be oscillating from time to time. All right? Okay, with that said, let's begin. So let me start with the question. How many of you have ever walked away from a conversation and suddenly become brilliant? A meeting or an argument or a date, and even a difficult conversation with your boss, it ends, and then 10 minutes later, while driving home, while taking a shower or laying in the bed or just being by yourself, the perfect response appears. And the perfect comeback comes to your mind. Explanation, boundary, question, all the things that were actually perfect for that moment return to your mind. And immediately you think, why didn't I say that in that moment? Maybe you replay the entire conversation in your head. Maybe you imagine alternate versions where you said exactly the right thing. Or maybe you just spent hours rewriting conversations that lasted in your mind for 5 minutes. And if you've done that, I want you to know something important before we begin. The problem is probably not what you think. Most people assume that they need to be quicker, or they need to be more confident, or they need to be better with words, or stop being awkward. But most importantly, spending so many years observing and studying communication and human behavior, I've discovered something very fascinating. The people who normally struggle most in high pressure situations are often the most thoughtful, the most analytical, and the most self aware, the most conscientious, to be precise. And what we are going to uncover today is that because when you understand what's actually happening inside that brain, it's important that two things will change. First, you will stop blaming yourself. And second, you will gain the ability to change it. Today, what we're going to learn are four major parts. First is to understand why your mind goes blank, to understand exactly what the brain's real priority is. Second, the hidden or the incognito habits that make you freeze. These are identifiable, but usually invisible with their patterns. Third is how to access the right words in real time. This is one of the most important aspects of today's webinar. There are practical techniques that will help you to respond instead of react. And the last one is how to leave the conversation without regret. This is what we all do, or we all have been there. You build a reflection framework that creates growth and not shame, right? And by the end of the webinar, I don't just want you to communicate better. I want you to understand yourself better. And because that's where the communication confidence will actually begin. All right? So let's dive in. The first part basically deals about why your mind goes blank, right? It's a mystery. So let me ask you another question. Why is it that when you think perfectly clear while talking to a friend about a difficult situation, but then the moment you're actually inside the situation yourself, your brain stops cooperating, right? This happens to all of us. Think about this. Imagine you're helping a friend to prepare for a difficult conversation with their boss. And then you can instantly see what they should say. You have a perspective, you have clarity, insight, confidence, all of those things, right? You know exactly what they should do and how they should respond. Then a week later, right, you're sitting in front of your manager, they challenge you for your work, question your decision, push back on the idea, and then suddenly your brain sounds like an old computer that is loading 10 programs at the same time. So now the question is, what exactly changed? Right? Did your intelligence disappear? Of course not. Something else happened. And understanding that something changes everything. So what we will learn now is basically to understand the priority of the brain. We always think, or most of the times we assume, that the brain's primary job is to help us think. It isn't. The brain's primary job is to help us survive. Everything else comes second. Language comes second, creativity, articulation, persuasion, everything comes second. Survival comes first, always. And for thousands of years, this has kept humans alive. Our ancestors survived because their brains constantly scanned for danger. And the modern problem is that the brain still uses the same machinery. The equipment is the same, the machinery, only that the threats have changed. Most of us are not running from predators anymore, but we are constantly encountering social threats. And the brain often responds similarly, not identically, but similarly. Examples, for example, when you're being criticized, rejected, embarrassed, or judged, challenged, excluded, humiliated, or feeling incompetent in some form, or you lose your status, disappointed by somebody, anything of these are basically interpreted the same way. The brain interprets these moments as significant and immediately shifts the resources towards protection, not expression, protection. And then this is where the communication problem begins. What we mean by that is that why do smart people or intelligent people freeze more than others? One of the biggest myths in this communication is that confident speakers think fast. But that's not necessarily true. In fact, many highly intelligent people freeze precisely because they think so much. Let me explain. Imagine I ask someone, what color is the snow? The answer would be very instant, white, right? Pretty simple. Now imagine if I ask, what is the most accurate way to explain your values, beliefs, ambitions, and life philosophy in one sentence? Now notice what happens. The challenge isn't getting or generating the answer. The challenge is selecting one. Suddenly there are dozens of possibilities that have now been generated in our minds. And highly intelligent people often experience this constantly during the conversations. They see multiple interpretations, multiple meanings, multiple outcomes, multiple ways in which their words can be received. And in these responses, while someone else is considering one answer, they are evaluating probably 20. And here's the irony. The person evaluating 20 possibilities often appears less confident than the person considering just one. Not because they're less capable, because they're carrying more cognitive load. Many thoughtful people aren't struggling just because they have nothing to say. They're struggling because they have too many things that they could say, and under pressure, the choice becomes harder, not easier. Now, let's add pressure into the equation, right? So suppose your boss asks you saying that like, hey, can you explain me why this project is behind schedule? Now your brain isn't just generating information, it's also managing consequences. So questions are being automatically generated like, will this affect my reputation? Will this affect my promotion? Do they think I'm incompetent? Or how should I phrase this? What am I saying wrong? Or what if they disagree? Yada, yada, yada. What if I sound defensive? All these kind of things. You notice what just happened. Basically, part of your brain is trying to answer the question, and the other part is monitoring risk, predicting outcomes, managing emotion. Your mental resources have now become divided. And the divided attention basically reduces performance. This is why pressure makes people sound less articulate than they actually are. Not because they are incapable, but because their attention is fragmented. Now, so I think I went to, yes, here. Now let's bring in authority, right? So let's talk about that. Many people notice that they communicate differently around authority, meaning bosses, executives, even parents, teachers, experts, even attractive people and influential people. Why? That's because authority changes the perceived consequences. The higher the perceived consequences, the greater the pressure. The greater the pressure, the narrower the attention becomes. And then when the narrower attention comes through, the harder it becomes to access language fluidity. This is why people who are witty around friends may sometimes be hesitant around leadership. It's not a personality problem, I can tell you that. It's a nervous system response. Dating also creates the same effect. The exact same mechanism appears when you're dating. Someone asks you, why do I become awkward around people I'm attracted to? Because now the stakes feel higher. Rejection becomes possible, evaluation becomes possible, loss becomes possible. So your brain becomes increasingly self-conscious, and self-conscious consumes attention. You stop experiencing the conversation and you start monitoring yourself inside the conversation, which brings us to the most important idea of the entire webinar: self-awareness versus self-interference. Now, most people assume self-awareness is always helpful. Not necessarily. Healthy self-awareness means I'm aware of my emotions. Unhealthy self-monitoring or self-awareness sounds like this: how do I look? How do I sound? Was that weird? Do they like me? Am I making sense? Should I say something else? Did I talk too much? What should I say next? Notice what's happening. In this situation, you're no longer participating in the conversation. You're observing yourself having the conversation. Imagine trying to drive while constantly watching yourself drive. The same thing happens conversationally. The more attention turns inwards, the less attention is remained available to project outwards, and the communication quality suffers. Now, why is it that the perfect response only appears afterwards? Because most people think, I didn't think of the response until later. Very important statement, right? But that's often not true. A more accurate explanation would be, I couldn't access the response until later. There's a huge difference, because if you couldn't think of it, you'd need better ideas. But if you couldn't access it, you would need better conditions. Think about what happens after the conversation ends. The pressure disappears, the evaluation disappears, uncertainty decreases, and your nervous system, it starts to bring it down to the baseline. It starts to return to the baseline. And then suddenly, perspective returns, creativity comes back, language returns, right? Insight comes back, and the comeback arrives. The perfect explanation arrives, the boundary arrives. All those things that were going on in your head, which you thought it should be said, they arrived perfectly. Not because your intelligence increased, it's because the interference decreased. The signal was always there. The noise got quieter. And that realization is incredibly freeing, because it means you don't have a thinking problem. You have an access problem, and the access can be trained. This is the most important reframe, I feel. Instead of saying, I am bad at communication, say, my brain is protecting me. Instead of saying, I never know what to say, I am experiencing pressure. Instead of saying, I'm awkward, say, my attention is overloaded. Because the labels we attach to ourselves become our identities. And many people have spent years building identities around experiences that actually are just temporary cognitive states. You are not your worst conversational moment. You're not your most awkward interaction. You are not that meeting where your mind went blank. And you're not that argument where you couldn't find your words. What I want to say is that these are just temporary moments. They are not your identities. And understanding that distinction is the first step towards genuine confidence. Now, moving on to the part two, right? Now we understand why freezing happens, but we also need to talk about many people accidentally make it worse, right? So before we start part two, I want to share something that may surprise you. Most people believe that communication problem happens when they're speaking and only speaking. It doesn't. The communication problem starts long before words have left your mouth. In fact, if you could see inside the minds of who are freezing constantly, in this case, I'd notice something very interesting. Very few of them lack intelligence. Very few of them lack opinions. Very few of them lack things to say. Instead, they are running these invisible mental habits that consume enormous amounts of cognitive energy. We're going to see that in a moment. Basically, the challenge isn't the lack of thoughts. The challenge is that those thoughts are competing with other processes. And think of your mind like a computer, right? Every application consumes memory. The more applications running in the background, the slower everything becomes. Conversation works exactly the same. Most people enter important conversations with a mental application already running at the back. Now imagine if it's already taking the bandwidth, what's going to happen? And then they wonder why communication feels difficult. So today we're going to identify those hidden applications because once you see them, you can then begin closing them one by one. Okay? All right, so habit number one, which is the silent confidence killer, right? It's self-monitoring while speaking. So let's begin perhaps with the self-monitoring aspect where this happens when you're basically having a conversation while simultaneously evaluating yourself from the inside. We touched base on this like briefly in the beginning. Maybe you've experienced this. You're talking to someone and a second voice appears in your head and it starts asking you questions like, am I making sense? Did that sound intelligent? Should I have said that differently? Or do they agree with me? Am I talking too much? Why did this phrase go that way? That sounded awkward. Oh, I need to recover from this. All of these pep talks that you have inside, the moment that voice appears, something important happens. Your attention starts to split. And then the divided attention always reduces the performance. Now imagine, like I said, driving, imagine trying to play tennis while simultaneously analyzing every movement of your body. You're definitely going to perform very well, right? So that is basically what this means. Imagine dancing while critiquing on every single step that you make. That's again, very difficult to do. So basically, performance would deteriorate immediately if you're doing this. Yet people do this instinctively and they do this exactly during conversations, and then they wonder why it feels very difficult. And here's the paradox of self consciousness. The irony of that self monitoring usually begins with good intentions. You want to communicate well, you want to be thoughtful, you want to avoid mistakes, you want to make a positive impression, completely understandable, right? But eventually, awareness comes or becomes interference. You become less focused on understanding the conversation and more focused on managing the image within the conversation. This is very common. And at that point of time, communication becomes more of a performance, and performance creates pressure. Pressure creates tension, and tension creates cognitive narrowing. This is one reason children often communicate much more freely than adults because they are present. Adults are frequently editing themselves in real time. And what confident communicators do differently in this case? I mean, confident communicators don't or aren't necessarily less aware. They simply focus differently. What they do is instead of asking themselves constantly that, how am I doing? They ask, what is this person trying to communicate? You see, they're trying to project their scope outwards. Instead of monitoring themselves, they become curious about others. And curiosity is remarkably powerful because attention can only exist in one place at a time. And the more interested you become, understanding the other person, the less energy remains available for self consciousness. The confidence often looks like certainty. But many times, confidence is simply attention directed outwards instead of inwards. Okay? Now, we have habit number two. This is another big one, the pressure to answer immediately. So let's talk about another hidden belief. A hidden belief here is that, like common for people, never question it, is that if I don't answer immediately, I will look incompetent. Many people enter conversations carrying these assumptions, and it creates enormous pressure. The moment someone asks a difficult question, their brain starts a countdown clock. Respond now, respond quickly, respond perfectly. Don't pause, don't hesitate, don't think too much. Just say something, anything immediately. But here's the problem. The brain performs worse under this artificial urgency. The reason why fast is not always smart is that, like, think about the smartest people you've met, the truly impressive people, leaders, experts, the individuals whose opinions carry weight. Many of them aren't specifically fast responders. They deliberately respond slowly. They allow themselves time to think. They aren't uncomfortable with silence. They're comfortable prioritizing quality over speed. Yet, many people assume controversial confidence means instant answers, not necessarily. Sometimes instant answers simply means fewer filters. Sometimes instant answers means less reflection. Sometimes instant answer means less awareness or nuance. Meanwhile, thoughtful people hesitate because they're trying to answer accurately. Unfortunately, accuracy and speed don't always coexist. And here's the internal panic cycle, right? Here's what happens often. A difficult question appears, pressure rises, the brain starts to rush, and then now the thought quality starts to decrease. The response time feels incomplete or response feels incomplete, confidence drops, and then the pressure rises further. And the next response becomes even harder. And then suddenly the whole conversation is now feeling overwhelming. Now, not because of the question was difficult, but because the urgency was hijacked in cognition. Many communication problems are actually pacing problems, not intelligence problems. Now, habit number 3, emotional narrowing. Now, let's discuss this. It's very important because most people think that emotions actually affect communication because they make us they do regrettable things. But that's true, but there's something deeper happening. Emotion changes what information becomes available. Imagine you are calm, you're completely normal in your normal state. And now in this state, you have perspective, you have creativity, you have memory, reasoning, nuance, empathy, all these long-term thinking, all these kind of things. Now imagine when you're angry or maybe embarrassed or I don't know, defensive, ashamed, anxious. You notice what happens at that time? Your attention, it narrows, becomes more rigid, your perspective, it shrinks, and certain thoughts become very hard and other thoughts become inaccessible for you. Your brain starts to prioritize immediate protection, like we read about or heard about it earlier, not balanced communication anymore. And this is because of emotional bandwidth. What is emotional bandwidth? Think of emotional intensity as a consuming bandwidth. You know, remember the example of the computer? It's similar, right? The stronger the emotional reaction, the less bandwidth remains available for communication because it's consuming that for processing. Now, this explains something many people experience. They leave an argument and suddenly they think of 10 brilliant responses. Why? It's because emotional processing stopped consuming the resources. Mental capacity became available again, and this is why emotional regulation is not separate from communication. It's a part of communication very well. A person who cannot regulate emotional activation is always going to struggle to communicate effectively under pressure. Not because they're incapable, but because their resources are going to be occupied elsewhere. Then let's look at habit number 4, discomfort avoidance. In this case, most people don't just rush to conversation because the conversation is moving very quickly. They rush because discomfort feels intolerable, and silence creates discomfort. So does uncertainty, and so does not knowing exactly what you say. Humans naturally want relief. The fastest way to get relief is to just say something, anything, immediately. And unfortunately, relief and effectiveness are not the same thing. Many regrettable responses begin as attempts to escape this discomfort and not intentional communication. I mean, think about that. The issue often is poor communication. The issue is discomfort avoidance. People aren't responding. They're escaping uncertainty, silence, vulnerability, pressure. And this escape rarely produces excellent communication. Now, the difference between relief and resolution. The distinction changed my understanding of communication altogether. So, relief solves your discomfort, resolution solves the actual situation. Reactive communication seeks relief, intentional communication seeks resolution. So, when someone criticizes you, relief says, that's not my fault. Resolution says, let's look at what happened. When someone challenges your idea, relief says, you don't understand. But resolution says, tell me more about your concern. One reduces internal tension, the other improves outcome. Confident communicators optimize for outcomes, not emotional relief. Now let's come to habit number 5, fear of silence. This is very common because silence terrifies many people. And yet, silence is one of the most powerful communication tools available. Why do people fear it? It's because silence creates uncertainty, and uncertainty activates the brain's prediction systems. The mind immediately starts to fill in these gaps. What are they thinking? Was that awkward? Do they disagree? Should I say something or did I make that mistake? The longer the silence, the louder these questions become, which explains why many people rush into filling empty space. Not because they have something important to say, but because silence feels emotionally uncomfortable. And the hidden meaning that we normally also attach to pauses doesn't help, right? So most people unconsciously interpret pauses as weaknesses, hesitation, confusion, social failure. But highly effective communicators often interpret pauses very differently as thoughtfulness, presence, control, composure. Now, imagine a lawyer or a CEO or anybody who's a respected leader. When you ask them a difficult question, do you think that they would appear stronger if they immediately answered or if they paused and usually considered carefully before they responded? The option second sounds more reasonable, right? Because pauses communicate something important. This person isn't being controlled by urgency. They are choosing their response, and the choice is power. The person who controls the pace basically controls the pressure. And here's the principle worth remembering, right? The person who controls the pace often controls the pressure, and most people allow conversations to dictate their speed. Confident communicators, on the other hand, intentionally influence the pace. They pause, clarify, ask questions, reflect, and think. This creates psychological space. And psychological space creates better decisions, which creates better communication, and then which creates better outcomes. Right? Now, the core distinction between reactive communication versus intentional communication. So everything we've discussed so far leads to one central distinction. Reactive communication is emotion to speech. Intentional communication is emotion, pause, choice, and then speech. Adding this one step, that's it, just this one step, not more, basically puts more intelligence, more charisma, more vocabulary, just one step, the pause, the choice, and then the communication. That single bit changes everything. And because of this one choice, the entire process of confidence enters the conversation. And when this confidence enters the process, the communication in itself becomes dramatically easier. Now, we move on to part 3, how to access the right words in real time, right? So now we understand two things. First, why the brain struggles under pressure. Second, the hidden habits that amplify that struggle. But understanding is not enough, right? Awareness without tools just creates frustration. So the real question becomes, how can we access these right words when the pressure is already happening? Right? How do we think clearly? How do we set boundaries, challenge people, recover, blah, 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 all of these things. Because confidence isn't about never feeling pressure. It's about knowing what to do when the pressure arrives. And that is exactly what we're going to go for now. Now, before we move in, right, now we're getting into the practical slide for this one. But before I teach you a single framework, I need to correct one of the biggest misconceptions about communication. Most people have the belief that the solution is going to help you think faster. It's not. The solution here is basically to learn how to think more clearly. And those are not the same thing. In fact, many communication problems comes from trying to think too quickly. Think about the last conversation you've regretted. Was the problem that you responded too slowly? Or was the problem that you responded before you had fully thought through what exactly you wanted to say? And for most people, it's the second. The issue isn't the lack of speed. The issue is basically lack of space, space to think, space to regulate emotions, space to organize your thoughts, space to choose intentionally rather than react automatically. And the techniques I'm about to teach you are basically having just one purpose: creating enough mental space for your intelligence to actually show up. Because remember, you don't have a thinking problem, you have an access problem. And these tools will improve the access. Okay. So, technique number one, the most underrated, but the pause. Let's begin with the simplest one. Now, when I say pause, most people immediately imagine awkward silence. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about intentional space, the ability to resist the urge to respond immediately. Because here's what most people don't realize: the first response your brain generates is not always the best response. It's simply your fastest response, and speed and quality are not the same thing, right? So what actually happens during a pause? Imagine somebody saying something challenging, like, I don't think this is a good idea, or why did you do it that way? Or I think you're wrong. Most people feel an immediate surge of defensiveness, pressure, urgency, and the impulse to respond instantly. The pause interrupts that impulse. Even 1 second helps. 2 seconds is powerful. 3 seconds feels enormous. During these moments, several important things happen. Your breathing stabilizes, your nervous system settles slightly, your emotional intensity drops, and your attention widens. Basically, in your brain, what's happening is your prefrontal cortex, the part that is responsible for reasoning and decision making, gets a chance to participate. And the pause isn't dead time. The pause is thinking time. It's basically for regulation. And the pause is basically power. Why pause increases the confidence? Here's something fascinating. People often believe that pause makes them look uncertain. Research and experience suggests the opposite. When somebody answers instantly every time, it can actually communicate impulsiveness. When someone pauses before responding, it often communicates thoughtfulness, deliberateness, composure, and presence. This also includes authority as well. Now, imagine a judge, CEO, or respected person who you revere to. Whenever you are in that position to ask a difficult question, and if they answered immediately, they won't do that. They would normally take some time to think and then respond accordingly. The pause is not weakness. The pause is evidence that your mind is working. Practical examples in this case, instead of answering immediately, you pause, you breathe, and then begin. Simply phrase it this way: uh, that's an interesting question. Or let me think about it for a moment. Or I want to answer that carefully. That was worth considering. Give me a second to think about it. All of these phrases, you see, notice something important. None of these phrases sound weak. They do not sound insecure. They sound intentional. And intentional creates confidence. Basically, these were the examples that I just gave. These examples can be used for you to get that moment to start thinking and start responding accordingly, right? But now let's take the next one. In this case, buying the time without sounding defensive. It's with curiosity. So one of the greatest communication myths is also that like every question deserves an immediate response. It does not, right? Many questions deserve exploration before answers. Yet people often feel trapped. Someone asks something difficult and they assume that I have to respond it to be right now. Not true. One of the easiest way to reduce pressure is to gather more information because clarity reduces cognitive load. Curious people, they think better, right? When people feel pressured, they usually become answer focused. Confident communicators become question focused. Why? Because questions accomplish three simultaneous things. They buy time, they create clarity, and they shift attention from self monitoring. Now, imagine someone saying, your presentation wasn't very convincing. Many people immediately defend themselves, but consider the alternative. What specifically felt unconvincing for you? Now, you see how it changed? This basically decreased the pressure, information increased, and clarity improved. And your brain gained time to think. So, what would be some of the powerful clarifying questions? Some of my favorites, I would say, is like when somebody asks something, what do you mean by that? You can add more. Can you elaborate? What's leading to that conclusion? Which part concerns you the most? How are you looking at it? Can you help me understand your perspective? All of these line items are basically not stalling tactics, but they are understanding tactics. And understanding almost always improves communication, right? Now we move to technique 3. Most communication anxiety comes from one hidden challenge. Your brain is trying to solve too many problems simultaneously. You're trying to figure out, what do I think? How do I say it? How should I phrase it? How will they react? What happens next? This overload creates panic. So, there's a principle that changes everything. When pressure rises, stop searching for perfect words. Search for structure. Structure reduces decision making, and fewer decisions means less cognitive load. Let's look at this framework, right? It's basically acknowledge, position, and explain. What does that mean? First step, acknowledge. Demonstrate the understanding. It's not agreement, understanding. Example, I understand why you'd see it that way. I can appreciate that concern. That's a reasonable question. I see where you're coming from. All of these are immediate tension decreasers. When people feel heard, the defensiveness gets lowered. Then comes step 2, position. State your perspective clearly, directly, without an apology by saying, my view is slightly different, or here's how I see it, or my experience has been different, or I'd approach it another way. There's no aggression, there's no justification, simply clarity. And then you come to step 3, where you explain, you provide your reasoning, and then you go forward by saying, the reason I see this differently is XYZ. What leads me to this conclusion is da da da. The challenge I see is XYZ. My concern is XYZ. That's how you frame it. This structure prevents, number one, rambling, it prevents defensiveness, and it dramatically improves clarity under stress. Right? Now, the next one is boundary. So let's take this one, boundary setting response. So many people believe that there are only two options when it comes to boundaries, being passive or being aggressive. Accept the poor treatment or create a conflict. Neither is true, right? Healthy boundaries exist in the middle, and healthy boundaries are surprisingly calm. Why aggression does not look like strength? Aggression often looks strong, but aggression usually indicates emotional activation. True confidence does not need volume. True confidence does not need hostility. True confidence does not need domination. Confidence needs clarity. That's all. So the boundary framework goes in this way. You make an observation, you set a standard, and then you state your consequence. For example, your observation is, I'm happy to discuss this. Your standard is, but I'm not willing to be spoken to that way. And then the consequence follows. If we can't keep it respectful, we'll need to continue this later. These three sentences sequentially set the boundary in a systematic manner. You can notice there was no attack, no insult, no escalation, just clarity. Calm boundaries are incredibly powerful because they force the others to engage with your position rather than your emotion, right? Now, calm conflict responses. The goal isn't winning. One reason people struggle with disagreements is because they unconsciously enter into their debate mode, and the debate mode changes everything. The objective becomes win, defend, prove, defeat, protect. But productive conversations rarely emerge from that mindset. Instead, what outcome am I trying to create would be a better ask, because communication is not combat. Communication is influence, and influence requires understanding. Also, have you heard about the validation principle? Here's the powerful truth, right? People become more willing to hear your perspective after they feel that theirs have been heard. This is why validation matters. Validation is not agreement. Validation simply means I understand your experience. Or example, I understand why that frustrated you. Or here's how I experienced it. And this follows after that. Here's how I experienced it. And the only way the person will be willing to hear that is after you have given the validation. So you can notice how much less threatening that feels when it follows a validation statement. The conversation remains collaborative rather than adversarial, right? Now comes the professional pushback. We all have had situations where in our professional career, we've had people who wanted to push back. And this particular pushback mechanism or framework will help you. So many professionals avoid speaking up, not because they lack ideas, but because they fear conflict or appearing difficult or damaging relationships. So they remain silent and later regret it. The solution is learning how to challenge ideas without challenging the people. So in this method, you basically start with an agreement of the notion of why the debate was going to begin in the first place. Meaning, I understand what, as an example, I can say, I understand what we are trying to accomplish, and I completely agree with that. So you're agreeing to the goal of what you originally started the discussion for. Now, now you follow it up with your concern. My concern is that the timeline may create quality issues. Then you follow with the alternative. Could we explore another approach? Or maybe can we do something this way or that way? Notice the psychology. The agreement reduces the resistance. Concern introduces a perspective. And then the alternative creates a collaboration. So you're not attacking, you're contributing. And this framework works in meetings, negotiations, leadership conversations, team discussions, etc. Okay. Okay, I think it changed now. All right, then let's come to social confidence situations, right? Recovering from awkward moments. Oh, this is nice. Let's address one of the biggest fears that people have, awkwardness. Many people assume that confident people never experience awkward moments. That's not true. Confident people simply recover faster, and that's the difference. Why awkwardness gets worse? Well, awkwardness usually escalates because people panic. Something slightly uncomfortable happens, and then they begin monitoring themselves. Then they overcorrect, start explaining, apologizing, become more uncomfortable, and the spiral keeps growing. But the original awkward moment was rarely the problem. The reaction was the issue. So the recovery principle, simple. You acknowledge, you reset, and you continue by saying in this way that I completely lost my train of thought. And when you say this, you basically acknowledge the issue and suddenly it loses power. You smile and then you continue. Or you can say that like that came out differently than I intended, then clarify. Or say, let me say that better and then continue. All of these aspects will allow you to bypass that awkward moment and not let it linger. Recovery demonstrates confidence, and perfection never does. Now let's talk about responding instead of reacting. So the most important skill of all, everything we've covered today ultimately comes down to one distinction. Reactive communication, emotion becomes speech. Intentional communication, emotion becomes information. Think about that. Most people treat emotions as instructions. Confident communicators treat emotions as data. Anger means something matters. Fear means something feels uncertain. Frustration means that something feels blocked. But emotions don't automatically dictate the behavior. They are simply providing you with information. The moment you understand that, you become free. Okay, now we come to the handling of passive aggression, right? Let's finish with one of the most requested topics in this case. Passive aggressive comments is something that we've all faced. So most people respond in one of two ways, right? Passive, ignore it, aggressive, attack back. Neither usually works. Instead, use curiosity, meaning must be some if somebody says this, must be nice having so much free time. Instead of lashing out or ignoring it completely, go ahead and ask this question, saying, like, what do you mean by that? Or can you explain what you're getting at? And be calm, neutral, and direct. Why this is powerful is because passive aggression depends on ambiguity. Clarity removes that ambiguity. The moment somebody must explain themselves explicitly, the hidden hostility loses its power. So now the core principle of real-time thinking, let's summarize everything, right? People often ask, how do I think of the right thing to say? The answer is basically going to surprise you, right? You don't find the right words by forcing your brain to work harder. You create conditions where good thinking becomes possible. And those conditions include pause, curiosity, structure, emotional regulation, clarity, and intentional pacing. The goal isn't becoming the fastest thinker in the room. Nope, that's not going to work. The goal is becoming the clearest thinker in the room. And when clarity improves, confidence follows naturally. Now we move to part 4. Okay. How to think clearly, how to set boundaries, how to recover, how to respond intentionally. But there's one final challenge we haven't addressed. Even after the conversations end, many people continue having them in their heads for hours. I know I have. Sometimes even days and years, by the way. So, in our final section, we're going to discuss why conversations linger in our minds, how perfectionism fuels anxiety or communication anxiety, and how to leave these interactions without carrying them for a very long time, right? So, let's begin. I want to start this final section again with a question. So, have you had a conversation? Just remember that last conversation, which you thought ended, but somehow never did. You left the room or the meeting finished, the call disconnected, the date was over, argument ended, and yet for hours you were still having the conversation, replaying it, rewriting it, rehearsing it, thinking, I should have said this, or why did I say that, or did I sound stupid? Maybe should I message them? Maybe should I defend myself? All these kind of thoughts. Most people think that the conversation ended externally, but internally it kept going. And for some people, this happens almost every day. A 5-minute interaction can occupy 5 hours of mental energy. And a 30-second awkward moment can live rent free in your head for a week. And if I were honest, sometimes even longer. So let's talk about that why, because once you understand why these conversations linger, you can stop them from being trapped, right? So the brain basically wants completion, right? So we know this. One of the brain's primary focus is prediction. Your brain constantly tries to answer the questions such as what's happening, what does it mean, what happens next, am I safe, did it go well, did it go badly? And humans are uncomfortable with unresolved certainty. And conversations create enormous uncertainty. Unlike mathematics, conversations rarely provide you definite answers. And after a meeting, you often don't know, did they agree? Did they disagree? Did I make a good impression? Did I communicate clearly? All these questions. The brain dislikes these unanswered questions. So it keeps working, trying to find closure, trying to find certainty, trying to solve something that can often cannot be solved. And that one reason the conversation keeps on replaying. The brain keeps searching for completion. Now, why does the mind rewrite the history? Here's something very fascinating. When people replay their conversations, they rarely replay them accurately, by the way. They replay them selectively, meaning the brain highlights the awkward sentence or the hesitation or the mistake, the missed opportunity, the criticism, the uncomfortable moment, and then minimizes everything else. Why? Because the brain is trying to preserve history. It's not trying to preserve history, it's basically trying to prevent future pain. It scans for potential mistakes because mistakes might contain, lessons. The problem is that this mechanism can become excessive. And instead of learning from the experiences, we become trapped inside of them. Now, imagine this. Suppose all of you individually are giving a presentation to, say, 50 people, and 49 people enjoyed it, but one person looked bored. What will most people think about afterwards? The bored person, right? It's not because they're irrational. It's because negative information attracts more attention than positive information. Psychologists call this negative bias. Your brain treats potential threats as more important than neutral experiences. This has helped us or our ancestors survive, but it often hurts modern confidence. It's because one awkward moment begins to outweigh 20 successful ones. Pretty shitty. Now we talk about reflection versus rumination. So we need to make this very important distinction. Reflection is healthy. Rumination is exhausting. The most people confuse the two. Let's define them. Reflection asks, what can I learn? Rumination asks, why wasn't I perfect? Reflection seeks growth. Rumination seeks certainty. Reflection moves forward. Rumination moves in circles. Reflection eventually produces an answer. Rumination produces another question. So, how do you know which one are you doing? Ask yourself, am I gaining new insight? If yes, you're reflecting. If you're simply replaying the same scene repeatedly over and over again without learning anything new, you are ruminating. And this distinction matters enormously because reflection improves your communication, but rumination destroys your confidence. So, what does rumination sound like? Something like this. Why did I say that? Why am I like this? Why can't I never communicate properly? What if they think I'm incompetent? What if I am ruining everything? All of these kind of questions that come to your mind are rumination questions, right? They don't create solutions. They create emotional loops. And basically, the mind keeps searching for certainty that does not exist. And because of this, the certainty never arrives and the loop continues. So now comes the part of perfectionism. We all know this. We are approaching basically the part where communication anxiety for many people comes down to perfectionism because most of the perfectionists think that the only reason why you are a perfectionist is that the image is to want exactly everything to be perfect. But that's only one version. The deeper version sounds like I should have handled that better. I should have known what should I say. I shouldn't have made that mistake. I should have been more confident, etc., etc. You notice the word should. Perfectionism is basically the belief that a flawless version of your interaction is available to you and you're somehow not able to achieve that. But that's the problem. The perfect conversation never existed. That's the myth of the perfect response. If only I had chosen the correct move, that thought, everything would have worked perfectly. But conversations aren't like chess. They're dynamic, they're messy, human, unpredictable. So you never possess complete information. You don't know how the other person feels, what happened in their day, what insecurities they have, what experiences they influence. All of these things are unknown to you. So now imagine, just like everyone else, you're trying to respond in real time with incomplete information. So expecting perfection under those conditions is so unrealistic. And yet many intelligent people hold themselves to exactly that standard. And then they wonder why communication feels so stressful. So what confidence is not never making mistakes. Let's destroy this myth, right? Confidence is not always knowing what to say, always being witty, always being composed, always being articulate, or always being impressive. Those standards are impossible. Real confidence is something much more simpler. Confidence is trusting yourself to recover. That's it. Not perfection, just recovery. Think about the people who you admire, right? All the people who you admire, do you think that they've never said something awkward? They've never missed opportunities, never regretted a response? Of course they do. But their awkwardness does not define them, right? An awkward interaction, they just say that that's awkward and then they move on. They don't say, I am awkward. That's the distinction, right? I didn't communicate well, not I am a poor communicator. And then that changes the identity or does not allow you to look yourself in that particular perspective. So confidence depends on separating those two. Now, basically, one thing you have to do after you have completed your conversation, which went awkward, you basically can reflect in a framework that will allow you to not fall into the trap of self criticism. What you do is you ask yourself question number one: what went well? Most people skip this entirely. They immediately search for mistakes, instead ask, what did I do effectively? Was I calm, etc.? What worked? What strengths appeared, etc. Question number two: what would I improve next time? Notice the wording, not what was wrong with me, but what would I improve? This keeps the focus on behavior rather than identity. And behavior can change. Identity feels permanent. Question number three, what will I practice moving forward? Learning requires action, not self criticism. And every conversation becomes training data. Every mistake becomes information. And the moment you adopt this mindset, communication anxiety begins to decrease because mistakes stop you from becoming the evidence against you, they become information for you. All right, conversations don't have to end just directly. You can revisit them in a professional manner, right? So a conversation does not always have to end. Many people assume I missed my chance. Oh, this is gone. I won't be able to open it. Not necessarily. In professional environments, especially, thoughtful follow-up is often respected. I've had some time to think about the conversation and I'd like to add something. Or after reflecting on our discussion, there's another perspective I'd like to share. Or I'd realized I didn't explain thinking very clearly earlier. Notice this communicates not weakness, maturity, thoughtfulness, self awareness, and most importantly, conversations happen across multiple interactions. So, not a single moment can be expected. This realization alone removes enormous pressure because suddenly every conversation stops feeling like a final exam, right? So with that said, the identity shift is something that we already touched base on. So it's very important that you make sure that you do not say things that are going to affect your identity of self perception, right? Because basically, if you say, you can say something like this, something is wrong with me, or I am experiencing pressure. Both these statements are dramatically different but describing the same situation. I'm bad at communication or I'm learning to communicate under pressure. Those interpretations create completely different futures. And that's the reason why one creates shame, the other creates growth. One creates avoidance, the other creates practice. One creates fear, the other creates confidence. It's very important to make sure that you protect your self perception. With that said, the final summary that I wanted to give you is that we have four key takeaways that we had originally planned. So we've understood now that why the mind goes blank. We've learned the hidden habits to amplify pressure, self-monitoring, urgency, emotional reactivity, all those kind of things. We've learned how to create thinking space, how to pause, regulate emotions, structural responses, and finally, how to stop carrying conversations long after they have ended, because communication confidence is not about becoming flawless. It's about being flexible, not being perfect, being resilient, and always not trying to be the perfect thing, trusting yourself, whenever you're not, so that you can recover, right? So I summarize that final message together. Before we move into the Q&A, and I know we are a little bit above the time schedule, so I apologize for that. It's very important to understand that like we have learned a lot of aspects today that can help you and that can allow you to engage these tactics directly. In fact, I encourage you to use these frameworks this week. Try the pause, use the boundary structures, practice clarification questions, or apply the reflection processes. You will see the results. And but what I've also discovered that like working with a lot of people globally, that knowledge creates the awareness, but you need practice for the transformation, right? And there was an old saying between what's the difference between knowledge and wisdom? Knowing the fact that a tomato is a fruit and not a vegetable is a knowledge. Not putting it into a fruit salad is wisdom. And you can only know that after you start practicing your craft. The reason for that I wanted to say is because communication with confidence is built through not just information alone, but making sure that you practice it and bring it into repetition more and more, which is why I have also created a course which is for high stakes conversation and conflict resolutions and negotiation, where I will teach you live, step by step, everything you need to know to become an expert in handling any form of conversation, both personal or professional, dealing with conflict or negotiation, especially when the stakes are high, right? And you can reach out on either the website or WhatsApp or Instagram. You have the code as well. You can scan it, and then we can move on to the Q&A.